Okay, class, so what I am going to be showing you with this little demo is I think it's useful for you guys to begin to see what it takes to paint the surfaces to create the illusion of something. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create one that looks kind of like brick and another piece, and I'm just using that green foam that I showed you the other day. So I haven't done a lot of prep to the surface except for this one. I wanted there to actually be a physical distinction on that surface. I'm going to ultimately do a little bit of a time lapse, but I want to kind of just get you kind of thinking about that. I'm using just sort of run-of-the-mill acrylic paints, but I may combine that with a little bit of this Liquitex acrylic gouache. And the reason I'm doing that is because it's a little more matte. And so I might kind of play with the sheen a little bit just because I like that level of kind of the character and quality. But a lot of times people, if they are kind of going to brick, then they might go immediately and say, oh, well, brick's red, so I'm going to start kind of immediately going to the red. But I'm actually going to create a base first that is kind of like the grout color, which the grout color is normally a little bit, it's kind of a grayish color. And so the brick one, I'm going to completely cover with that color. And I actually am going to warm it up a little tiny bit with just a little tiny bit of a reddishness, just so it's not so cold, but it's still kind of, you still read it as kind of gray. And so I'm going to paint this whole thing out, and I'm going to have to kind of force my paint down into the crevices, which is where the gray, which is going to be ultimately be the grout is. I'm going to do a little bit of a time lapse here in a second, so you're not sitting here, you know, basically watching paint dry. But I wanted you to see that there's actually, and it's easier to see once I paint it, there is some actual texture and surface variation that I've gotten there. And so I'm going to go ahead and let that dry and kind of do, and I have to kind of really force it down into some of those spots because there's some air pockets in there, and it really requires me kind of working the brush into those textured areas, and then I'm gonna come back and kind of play with the surface, the raised portion, the sort of what would be the brick. So I'm gonna move that to the side for a second, and then what I'm gonna do on the brick wall, I mean the concrete wall, is I'm gonna ultimately do a lot of layers. And I'm going to do more layers than you think would be normal, because the inclination normally would be like, oh, it's a kind of gray. That's what concrete looks like. So I'm going to start a little dark, and I'm going to get a layer on there. This will ultimately be my texture, or be sort of the base. And I might play with the texture a little bit, and I'll talk about that after I get to the next stage. But I'm gonna go ahead and get one layer down, because a lot of times when I want a lot of texture on things, whether it's I'm creating the illusion of something, or whether I am, you know, actually creating on something three-dimensional like this would be. I mean, this is obviously just a little sample, and I think it's valuable to do these kinds of samples from time to time. And certainly if you do any kind of samples to, like, hey, this is one technique I could try, and here's another technique, you can document that, even if you want to take pictures of the stages of layering, so that you convey to me your process and kind of how you focus on that and how you problem solve through that. That's valuable to me. So I'm going to stop the video for now. I'm going to continue working on some of my layers and also do a little bit of a time lapse, and I'll kind of be mixing these all together so you can kind of see what that looks like. Okay. Okay, due to technical errors, I didn't do the time lapse on this. There were some things I needed to wait for it to dry, and then anyway. So I've got a pretty good layer on here where I had the gray down first, and then I started to add this sort of reddish color. And one of the mistakes that people do is they make the colors too consistent and too even. So I began putting in the colors very randomly around here. But as I was painting, and I don't paint bricks normally, but as I was painting, I was like, oh, you know what would really kind of enhance this is a little bit of kind of like a little bit of a highlight on some of them, where I kind of come in and, or low light, or just kind of mess them up just a little bit so they're not too consistent, and it begins to give a little more of that texture. And so that might come in the form of kind of a lighter color, you know, that might look kind of like almost like a highlight, or it might come in the form of kind of a duller color, but just to kind of play on sort of adding to those textural qualities in there that gives it that feel of like over time these bricks have been done. But also, you know, bricks are not, you know, they're not perfect. And so by having, you know, these like little bits of this variation in there, it just makes it that much more interesting and really brings it to life much more. And, you know, and so I think it's always good to kind of work on that skill. And this may seem like overkill or unnecessary, but I think, you know, you got to see this as an opportunity of like, oh, can I create that illusion of, you know, that brick? And what is, you know, what am I going to learn from that? And what does it convey? And how does it create that quality that you really want to happen in your piece? And, you know, when you do a portfolio, they're not looking that you can just create a generic version of brick or whatever. You know, anybody can look at a YouTube tutorial and do that. But like, what do you bring to it? What do you add to it that makes it interesting? Do you show that you have that sense of observation of these nuances? You know, whenever these, you know, a film is being made, you know, where these worlds get created, you know, what are the little details that that really bring it to life and make it interesting? You know, they're the textures, they're the little small things that you almost don't notice unless you're an artist. And, you know, then you realize, oh, you know, somebody added this little thing. I mean, if you go and look at, regularly look at how movies are made, or, you know, that kind of thing, you'll see all the care that goes into some of these like seemingly benign and little tiny unnecessary details. And working on that skill, you might think, oh, well, I don't have that skill, and so you know, I'm just gonna have to do this or whatever it is. You know, that's what was going on. I think my grout lines were too stark. Yeah, see? Even as I'm sitting here working, I'm like, oh, something seems, I think they look too pretty. They're too consistent. And it's not grout, it's mortar lines. They need to be a little more kind of funky, and because some of the grime sits in there and some of it's kind of warmer and some of that's getting too pink, but that's all right. Some of the lines I can bring back in there. So my original, you know, base layer, which was kind of a grayish, was pretty cool gray. And I think even though some of that's kind of peeking through still, it looks much more interesting now that I've kind of just now got rid of that and sort of reestablished some of these lines. And so, you know, and this is where even if you, you know, even if you're not going to be a painter in the traditional sense, if you look at how worlds are created in animation, movies, film of different sorts, like little short films and things like that, you know, it's really about that eye for, you know, little tiny details. I'm not the most detail-oriented person, or it's definitely kind of a skill I had to work on. But it was a valuable enough skill that I was like, I need to work on this a little bit. And then, you know, lean into, oh yeah, see that? How that's starting to get there to me. Because it's getting more irregular. I think one of the things that students that are kind of in the early stages of their career, there's sort of this compulsion to make everything too pristine, too perfect, and it's like it's too consistent, or it's way too inconsistent. Like there's no, and so there we have, you know, kind of a pretty good suggestion. It's got some texture and wear. There's some warmer colors and cooler colors, or rosier colors and redder colors in there for you to look at. I'm gonna have to let this one dry a little bit. I mean, I could probably kind of blow a little bit. If you do and use a hair dryer like that, this is actually a heat gun. It's a lower temp heat gun. if you use anything to dry paint, acrylic paint specifically, just make sure that the heat source doesn't get too close to the acrylic. Acrylic does not do really well with heat, and it will actually cause it to melt. So right now I've got some layers happening on here. It's not quite where I want it. It looks a little too like brushstroke, and I don't want it to look brushstrokey, so I'm gonna intervene and get some little bits of things happening on there that'll help eliminate that quality, and then I'll come back and I'll probably have a still photo of that in the information for this demo. Okay, so this is getting really nice and kind of worn and aged, and there's gunk buildup on there, and that's exactly, I don't know where this wall is, but I'm just thinking it's just like one of those, I added just weird stuff that I had on hand, and I'll show you a couple of those things. And some of them were in good shape, and some some of the things weren't in great shape. And that's actually kind of worked in my favor, because it made this one thing. So I'm using a little thinner paint. It's more of a ink. And one of the things I've always loved about the inks, and this is one of those, and it's high flow acrylic, is its ability to kind of run and flow and move on a surface in some interesting ways. And so it kind of absorbs into some of these materials that I'm using to really create this kind of rough and worn surface that I'm kind of working on here as a way to create just like I don't know if it's like part of a city scene or part of I mean, I could use even some similar techniques and just add some sort of mossy stuff on there. Let's say I might even begin to do that a little bit. So this could even begin to look like a rock that had some kind of mossiness or whatever. I'm going to put a little bit of get a little bit of a green happening so that you can see if I wanted this to look more natural, what that would maybe kind of begin to be. And so I'm choosing a green that's not one I usually recommend people get, but it's one I use sort of from time to time when I've done things that I want to look real earthy, and it's sort of already there. So it's kind of got this mossiness. I'm adding it to my sepia, and so the minute I begin to do that, I start to get this sort of mossy. So one of the things I added, and I have this for what reason, I have no idea. It's a flocking powder. And so it's this kind of powdery material, and I added some of that on there. And you can use the same kind of stuff for like moss and things in model making. I use it in kind of unconventional ways, but now this is going from being like a city wall to, you know, looking much more like a rock found in nature. You know, I started to get it so worn and rough and everything that it started to do that. But I could have left it without the greens. I just sort of started thinking of like, what would nature look like? And some of the warm browns I was getting. And even in some urban areas, you're going to find some kind of moss growing on some areas, probably more in areas where there's where you'll find more humidity or more natural vegetation. A little harder in New York City and stuff like that. But y'all don't live in New York City. At least nobody's identified themselves as having lived in New York City and taken this class remotely. So anyway, so this is, you know, this is sort of my worn surface, and it originally looked just like this on the back. So, you know, something that's earthier, or it could, if it's kept it much more industrial looking and didn't add the warmer browns and everything. But then I have my brick, and that kind of gives you a feel of like, how do you create these kind of faux surfaces, if you will. And acrylic paint is great for that. I even used a little bit of this acrylic gouache because it is very matte, and I kind of like that quality, but then I added this flocking powder, But the thing is, you can mix in dirt for that matter, or sawdust, or, some little, scraps of things and mix it in there. I also ended up using some light molding paste. I've added little black plaster flakes into things that I need to be really gnarly and kind of gross and like kind of rocky and things like that. So there's any number of ways that you can do that.